you don't know me, I'm Pastor Brad. Thanks so much for joining us in person here or online. We're grateful that you've given us a little bit of your Sunday to connect in. And what we're doing this week is we're starting our Easter series. This is crazy to me that we're already at the point of 2022 that we're talking about Easter. I feel like we just crossed New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, and now we're already kind of a third of the way through. And so that's a little concerning for me because if you haven't noticed, the older you get, the faster time seems to go. I remember thinking as a little kid that a year, that'll take forever. Now I'm like, that felt like a week, right? And it's easy for life to rush by us. So what we're doing is we're taking 3 weeks to look in this context of the Easter season, this idea that there's a problem of Jesus. Maybe that sounds a little weird coming from a kind of a church person or a church feed online. What do you mean a problem of Jesus? Well, I want to explore that idea. So what is this idea of the problem of Jesus? This was kind of birthed out of a book written by Mark Clark. It was actually called The Problem of Jesus. And he explores in here the notion that Jesus creates a problem. Now, by problem, we mean the opportunity to discuss, the idea that it challenges things maybe of the status quo or of what we're already thinking. That anytime there's a problem, you have to engage it to see what the solution is, to see what impact it has. So that's what we want to do because it is so easy to be almost flippant about Jesus. To just let it be that thing that we maybe sing us about in songs. Maybe we say a little prayer before our meal and end it in Jesus' name. But the person of Jesus can be so easy to miss. And I want to suggest that it is the one thing we can't. So we're going to talk about the problem of Jesus. I want to look at some of what Mark said just at the beginning here. And I want you to know two things before we go. First of all, the content you're going to hear after we get through Mark's stuff, it's probably stuff you've heard before, but it's setting the stage. And you've probably heard it before if you've had any connection to church, because we're going to talk about what happened when Jesus died. We're going to talk about that. And because of that, I need to give you one of my infamous PG-13 warnings, okay? Occasionally we talk about stuff, and what we want to do is we always want to be very open about what we talk about. If the Bible talks about it, we want to talk about it. Well, the Bible talks about what happened when Jesus died. And the thing is, it's not pretty. And we're going to be a little graphic with some stuff. So I'm giving you in the room, if you've got kids with you, if you're online and you're watching with kids, I am not ashamed of anything we're going to say, but I understand developmentally it might not be the best for some children. So Emily, you might want to escort Christian out of the room. I'm not sure if he is ready yet. But is that fair? You guys have been duly warned, right? Okay. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to investigate a little bit about this problem of Jesus. This is what Mark Clark wrote, part of what he wrote. He says, the story, and this is a little bit longer, but I think it's really good. The story of Jesus's earthly life is a scandal. Don't miss that word. In the Greek language, there's a word, skandalos. And that's where we get our word scandal. And it is used specifically of Jesus a number of times, talking about what he did and how it scandalized others, or what he did created a scandal. So even in the very text of that the Bible was originally written in, Jesus creates a problem. He creates a scandal from beginning to end. Who he was, what he said, what he did, and how his life and teachings continue to influence our modern world is, without a doubt, the greatest of all scandals. In the modern Western world, Jesus of Nazareth is associated with many things, but scandal isn't one of them. He is a nice guy, a good leader, a great teacher, or an example of love, but most of us don't find anything particularly scandalous about him, right? Jesus is a nice guy. Most people, maybe even a lot of Christians, people who gather together for stuff like this, think about Jesus kind of like the Gandhi of Christianity. Well, he was this nice guy who loved others and was nonviolent, and he's nice, and he often wears a little toga, and he carries a little lamb, and he looks strangely Norwegian for having lived in the Middle East, right? Okay, that's kind of this picture we have of Jesus. Well, he goes on and he says this: a scandalous person stirs the pot. They do something controversial. They violate norms and upset the status quo. They say or do something that gets people talking about the water, gets people talking around the water cooler. It's something that offends us, causes us to lean in with fascination or recoil in horror. Scandal is front page news kind of stuff, and that's not Jesus. Or is it? Well, and I think you're catching that what Mark is writing here, or what I would agree is that it is Jesus, if we really look at it. He says then, what if Jesus was a problem, a walking controversy? What if wherever he went in life, from the day he was born until the day he died, he was followed by scandal? What if instead of a nice guy and a safe guy, he was a disturber of the peace? A man many people didn't actually like. A man who challenged the status quo and made life less safe for the family and friends who orbited around him. Over and over again, the Bible tells us this is exactly what Jesus did. If you're familiar with the Bible, not just like I've heard some verses read, I've been around, but if you've actually read the thing, if you've read what we call the Gospels in the New Testament, the stories of Jesus' life, you'll find out that that is true. Again and again and again, Jesus challenged the status quo. He went right up toe-to-toe with religious leaders who were being hypocrites, who were being what we call today Pharisaical. He created stir wherever he went. He often incited mobs to want to kill him for what he preached. We think of Jesus saying, love your neighbor. And everyone's like, yes, we should love our neighbor. What Jesus said made people want to literally stone him to death. That's scandalous. Now, what do we do with that? Because Jesus, for whoever you are, wherever you're at, whether you do follow him today, whether you don't, whether you have no idea who he is, whether you're super familiar with him, he will challenge where you're at. What are you going to do with the problem of Jesus? Because everything goes back to him. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at kind of today what happened. Next week, we're going to have the opportunity to talk more about what it meant. So this is kind of a, you buy one, you got to buy the second one too. And by that I mean, if you're here today, today's not the end of the story. Next week, we're going to talk about what it really meant. It's super powerful. I expect you, hope for you to come and hear it, because that's why Jesus died. What we find out next week. But what we're going to talk about is kind of what happened and the significance thereof. But all of history has taught us now, for the last 2,000 years, that what you think of this person, of this man, Jesus, is the linchpin. It's the pivot point for everyone in this room. All of history has pointed to that. No other person in the entire course of human history has had more to do with historical events than the person of Jesus. We literally mark the ages of our civilization by before and after his time on earth. That's remarkable. Wars have been fought. Peace has been established. Rights have been trampled, and they've been validated, all in the name of Jesus. Whether or not we do it right or wrong, so much circles around this person of Jesus, you can't get away from the question of what do you do with the person of Jesus? Because here's the options. As we look at what the Bible says about Jesus, and this is not a 1 or 2 or 3 kind of message thing, we look at what Jesus said every week that we gather together in our smaller groups together, what we call life groups. We spend time talking about what Jesus said because it is pivotal for all of life. But if what Jesus said, he actually said, and if he actually believed it, there's only a few options. Either he's the Lord of all creation like he claims to be, he's a lunatic and completely out of his mind, or he's an outright liar. And you have to take a position. There's not a third direction available. It's either yes, Jesus, or no, Jesus. And we have to make that decision. It's the most important decision I would suggest that any of us can make. Because when you make that, it really is for you, not only for all of history, it's for you, the linchpin of the rest of your life. So, we're going to start with this. What happened when Jesus died. We're going to be looking in Matthew 27. If you want to follow along, we're going to be going through pretty quick and a lot of verses. But we're telling the story of what happened after Jesus came to the city of Jerusalem during the Passover. He was betrayed. And then came the events that follow, what we call the Passion, if you're familiar with kind of churchy words, of Jesus. In fact, there was a Mel Gibson movie called The Passion of the Christ. Has anyone in here seen that movie, The Passion of the Christ? A few of you. Now, here's the thing. I've had people tell me, yeah, I just couldn't watch it. I can't watch it. It's too bloody. Let me challenge you. This is not about shaming you if you haven't, but let me challenge you. Because the significance of the blood affects our understanding of what Jesus did, just on the physical side of things. If we can wrap our heads around just the physical torment, not let alone the spiritual, that Jesus went through, it gives meaning and significance to why we say this is so important, to what it means that Jesus did this. It tells us why. So I would challenge you, if you haven't seen it, go ahead and take a look. It's not strictly biblical, but it gives a great picture of what it is that Jesus actually went through for those he says that he loves. But here we're going to start in Matthew 27. And in Matthew 27, starting in verse 26, we read this. He released for them, and this is Pilate, this guy named Barabbas. And Barabbas was this rabble-rousing, riotous, murderous dude. And the religious leaders stirred up this crowd so that Pilate, every year he would release one prisoner. He said, do you want me to release Jesus? And the religious leaders stirred the crowd up to say, no, give us the murderer. Kill Jesus. So he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus. Now, scourged is an interesting word. How many of you have been scourged in here? Anybody? No, I guarantee you none of you have. What they would use in the Roman scourging, which this is what this was a Roman execution. It's a short whip called a flagrum, or some would call it a cat of nine tails. Lots of braided leather thongs with pieces of metal or bone embedded in it. The person who was being scourged or flogged would be stripped of their clothing, tied up to a stake, and stretched out so that the skin and muscles and everything were tight. And then there would be two soldiers, one on each side, who would take alternating lashes with these whips into the flesh of the individual. And often they would then flip the person over after they finished one side and begin on the front, okay? The goal of this was to weaken the victim just short of death or unconsciousness. They wanted to just start everything out in the most gruesome way possible. Literally, victims of this scourging would have tatters of flesh just hanging down with exposed ribs, with sometimes organs poking out. There were stories of people being disemboweled by this process. And this is the start. So having Jesus scourged, what a little phrase we would just maybe pass by, the story of Jesus. They said that they delivered him to be crucified. And I want you to know that some of this material I'm going through came through some research by J.D. Greer, as well as an article. And I have copies of the article, okay, if anyone's interested. It's like a 9-page article from the Journal of American Medical Association, I believe is how it goes. But it's a secular medical journal that talked about what would have happened physically to a person during a crucifixion and this process. So if you're interested, I can get that into your hands. But when they were done with the scourging, they went away to have him be crucified. Now we're going to talk more about what crucifixion is a little bit later when we get to that point in the story. But you have to understand this thing was designed to be the worst thing possible. It was pioneered by the Persians, and it was perfected by the Romans, meaning they found a way to make the process of dying last as long as possible in the most painful way possible. It was typically reserved for the worst of the worst, okay, or who they branded to be the worst of the worst. Typically, it was those who opposed the authority of Rome in some way or another. Those were the ones who were subject to this punishment. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Verse 27, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. So here's a guy having been scourged, flesh in tatters, he is taken on this journey towards crucifixion and into the governor's headquarters, the boss of the Roman world here. And they gathered the whole battalion. This was the Speria, a cohort is what it's called. It was usually about 480 people. Okay? If you look around the room today, I'm guessing in our room right now, we have about 65 people, give or take. Think how many times the number of people that are in this room right now would need to be gathered to reach 480. It's a large crowd staring at you as you have been brutally tortured and know that death is coming. This was a power play meant to humiliate Jesus. As we keep going, verse 28, it says, and they stripped him. Again, they're in front of the battalion. He had all of his clothing ripped off of him. Now, here's the problem with this, because some of his clothing would have started to adhere to some of the wounds, would have been maybe mashed into it in one way or another through the manhandling of Jesus, and now that is ripped out, tearing anew those wounds. They were humiliating him, and they continued. They put a scarlet robe on him and twisting together a crown of thorns. Now, this is interesting, this is traditionally the euphorbia plant, or Euphorbia milli plant. It was introduced to the Middle East, so the area where this took place, from Madagascar, and it typically had about 1-inch thorns on it, okay? Have any of you ever seen a rose? Anybody? A rose, right? Okay, a few of you. Okay, not as many hands as I should see in this room, so guys, step up your game, okay? You're lacking there. But we got the rose. What's on a rose stem? Thorn. Do you know how big a rose thorn is? About a 1/4 inch. Think of a thorn 4 times as long. And it was usually pretty straight. But the thing was, it was also moderately poisonous. And in fact, if you handle this plant today, horticulturists recommend you always wear gloves no matter what you're doing because of the poison that's associated with these thorn pricks. So what they would do is they took this and twisted it into a circle and a circle and a circle, and they didn't rest it like a neat little tiara on the top of Jesus' head. They would have made a tight-fitting wound braid, basically, of these thorn branches and would have jammed it down to scrape through and pierce the skin with poisonous barbs onto the head of Jesus. And they did it as a crown because they were mocking his claim to be the King of Kings. So as they were humiliating him, they continued to torture him. They put it on his head and they put a reed in his hand. This was the idea of a scepter, except a reed was something that would flip around and be blown by the wind. It wasn't sturdy. It didn't actually represent authority. They were mocking him and his claim of kingly authority. And then they knelt before him, what you would do before a sovereign, before a lord. And they, what word was that? Mocked him. Not like a gentle ribbing or a gentle joking. It's not like Christian claiming earlier that I was ugly, right? Okay? We can do that back and forth. This was mocking. This was saying you are worthless and we will laugh at you and scorn you in front of hundreds of people. And they said to him, "Hail, King of the Jews." So when they were finished with all that wonderful treatment, we get to verse 30. It says they spit on him. Can you think of something more disrespectful than being spit on? It's horrible, right? If I walked up to you right now and spit in your face, like literally spit in your face, you would have a pretty visceral reaction to that, right? What would happen in this situation is they would kind of walk by him almost in a line and keep spitting and spitting and spitting on his torn and bloodied face. Then they took the reed that they had placed in his hand and they struck him on the head. They beat him with what they mockingly put as his symbol of authority. Then, when they had mocked him, again, you see their whole process here, they stripped him of the robe they had put on him. Again, exposing his nakedness in front of hundreds of people, and put his own clothes, his own bloody, tattered clothes, saying, "This is all you're worth." And they led him away to crucify him. Well, as they went out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. They compelled this man to carry his cross. Now, here's the thing about the cross. We have romanticized the cross in the Christian faith. When I say the word cross, do you know what is heard by most people, or what is seen, what is pictured? I can help you because we've got a visual representation of it. You see that thing behind me on the stage? That's what we think of. We think of this nicely cut, nicely adhered together, stained and sanded, thing that you hang up on the wall. Look at that pretty cross. I remember as a youngster, I believe it was in high school, I was working a job and I saved money and saved money and saved money. And as a good son, I bought my mama a cross to wear around her neck, right? And that came from a place of wanting to honor my mama, but also honor her faith. And, there was an identification with Jesus, and that's all good. But we have to remember the fact that that was nothing like what Jesus' cross was. The closest thing we could say today would be for us to put a necklace with a miniature electric chair hanging off of it. This is an instrument of death and humiliation, of saying you are worth nothing. And we can hold that up because Jesus embraced that shame for a reason. But we have to understand that picture is not, don't picture that when you're thinking of the story of Jesus. See, this crossbar was estimated to be between 75 and 125 pounds, okay? Have you guys seen my son Josiah running around the room? He's roughly 75 pounds. So him or almost double of him, put on your shoulders and carry around. But what you're carrying around is not a pristine cross. Because, the Romans were nothing if they were not cost efficient. See, they wouldn't throw a cross away when they were done. They would just reuse it. And they didn't believe in this concept of hand sanitizer. Literally, it would be stained and tattered with the bloody remains of the previous victims, stained with their gore and their filth. And he was forced here to carry that over the nape of his neck and walk this long journey from the place of his imprisonment to the place of his execution, with his own flesh torn and tattered, and that gore and that literally excrement all smeared over it, rubbing into his wounds. This is what it meant to carry his cross. And it says that when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. Now there's two times he's offered wine, and they're different kinds of wines for different purposes. This was actually like the idea of being given a Tylenol, okay? Because this idea of mixed with gall, that word gall is actually a reference to myrrh. And myrrh happens to be a mild painkiller. Simon Cotton of Chemistry World said, chemists at the University of Florence have found that the molecules of myrrh act on the brain's opioid receptors, explaining its pain-killing action. So myrrh could be used to dull a little bit of the pain. Now, mind you, it's like taking a Tylenol for a gunshot wound at this point. It's not that it would make him like loopy and miss out, but it was, hey, we'll take just a little bit of the edge off. And the idea was this could keep you from going into shock, so we could keep your humiliation going on longer. But Jesus refused it, and he's not saying, well, it's wrong to take painkillers, I won't do that. He was saying, I am going to fully, open-eyed accept everything that's going to happen. I will not try to dull it in any way, so that you know how intentional I am about it. And remember, there were a few visitors in Jesus' birth story who came from afar. Do you remember them? We three kings of Orient are, right? If you don't work with me, I'm going to keep singing. And that's painful, I know that. The three wise men, right? The three magi. Do you remember the gifts they brought? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This was the plan from the beginning. This did not accidentally happen to Jesus. That symbol at his birth was pointing to what his death would look like. It was written before the foundation of the world that God knew everything that would happen and that Jesus would step this way. So let's finish the story up here. It says, when they had crucified him, and this is where we need to talk about crucifixion. When you were crucified, you were hung down, suspended by the arms. Your feet were nailed, so you couldn't really support yourself, but you had to push up on them to find some level of support. And then you were nailed typically through the wrist. The Greek words for hand can mean hand, wrist, the whole arm. And the evidence, historical evidence, doesn't support the typical picture of through this part of the hand. Do you know why? If you put a nail through there and put, let's say, a couple 100 pounds, what's going to happen to the nail? It's going to rip right out. But if you put it through the wrist, the bone structure, and this is what the Romans found, you can support your body weight. And that Greek phrase for hand, where it talks about where it goes, can be used for wrist or part of the arm. That's what would happen. And it wasn't typically the cross like we would see here. Most likely this was not the cross. Most likely it looked like a T, all right, that he was hung down on. See, now when this was happening, as this brutal process was happening, blood vessels around the stomach would get swollen from the pressure, and they would gorge with excess amounts of blood. And then when as you were hanging down, you wouldn't be able to breathe. You would start to suffocate. So the only thing you could do was to hoist yourself up by your arms, because you couldn't really support with your legs because of how they were bent and nailed. You would hoist yourselves up by the arms to breathe in, pulling on those hand nails in your wrist, which has a lot of nerves in there, and would create excruciating pain from the nails, and cramps would seize your muscles. And then as you were hanging down like this, you could inhale but not exhale. They would keep your lungs from deflating. And when you did this up and down constantly with a back that had been scourged, do you know what would happen? Continue to rip open those wounds, pull off more of your flesh, more of your blood would spill. This is where those exposed organs or whatnot with this not nicely hewn cross could actually puncture and rupture some of your organs. This was a horrible, searing pain, a horrible suffocation and humiliation that for Jesus lasted 6 hours. When I stub my toe, I have to fight to keep every expletive I've ever heard from coming out of my mouth. And then 25 seconds later, I forget that I stubbed my toe, right? But I feel like everything is ending for that 25 seconds of toe stubbage. Jesus experienced this horrible, humiliating, brutal torture for 6 hours. And that, by the way, when they found that he was dead at 6 hours, they were surprised because typically it lasted a lot longer. It could go on for days. And here's where we see the story kind of wrapping up. Verse 45, now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. And that is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, this man is calling Elijah. He was actually quoting from Psalm 22, the first line of Psalm 22, which was a Jewish thing to do of the day, where if you would quote the start of something, you would refer to the whole thing. Because some people would say, what does it mean that God was forsaken? Well, in that moment, Jesus bore the full penalty of sin. We'll talk about that next week. But what he was doing by quoting the beginning was to refer to the whole thing. And we have modern examples of this. It's called a synecdoche, where you quote part of something to refer to the whole. At the end of Psalm 22 that he quoted at the beginning, we read this, for he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him. So Jesus was saying he was feeling the full forsaking, but knowing that God could be trusted to see him through it all, even in that moment. He never despaired. As we, again, hit the last couple verses, and at once one of them ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink. When the other said, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him, at that point, Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. This is from the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. Two of our other gospel accounts actually record some of these final words. John records them as tetelestai, which was a Greek word that was found on tax bills after they had been paid. Jesus said, "It is finished." That's the translation. It was used to say of these bills where something was owed, now it had been paid in completion. This is what Jesus called out. Luke says one of the final things he said was, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." This is chapter 23 and verse 46. What this does is demonstrating Jesus' trust in the Father to the very end. He committed himself to the Father even though he had just gone through all this. So what happened when Jesus died? I don't share all that to try to gross you out. It's not for shock value. I want to share that because it's important for us to remember who Jesus was, to remember what he did. And next week, like I said, we're going to really talk about what that all meant. And what it means is the most revolutionary thing that has ever occurred. But for us, right now, just for the fact that what happened when Jesus died, I want to say this: he really died. Some people have questioned that. There's a theory out there called I believe it's the resuscitation theory, that he was just really exhausted from this, so that they took him down from the cross. He wasn't really dead, and when they put him in a tomb, the cold, damp air refreshed him, and he got up from it. Did you hear everything that he went through? There is no possible way. And both religious historians, secular historians, Christian historians, Jewish historians, all attest to the fact that Jesus really did live, and they attest to his death. Josephus did it in his book called Antiquities. Another early Greek historian, Thales, talked about a solar eclipse. And he was talking about this solar eclipse not being possible during the week of the Passover because of certain things happening, and that was the time, he quotes, that Jesus died. So historians, contemporary, he was from about 50 AD, that close to the events, talked about it as if it really happened. Whether or not they believed in the significance of it is another thing, but the fact of the matter is Jesus really died. He really lived, and he really died. Now, one of the linchpins of the story of Jesus is what happens 3 days later. But we'll talk about that in 2 weeks. So this is why you just have to keep coming back. We're just stringing you along here so that you get the fullness of what we're talking about. But the second thing that happened was that he died willingly. You have to understand, Jesus wasn't caught unawares and, oh my goodness, what am I going to do now? I've got to make the best of a bad situation, I guess. No, in the Gospel of John, chapter 10, he says these words, "I lay down my life for the sheep." He calls himself the good shepherd. He says, "I lay my life down for the sheep. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my accord. I have authority," he says. This was not an accidental happenstance that God capitalized on. Jesus really died, and he did it willingly, clear-headedly. He knew what was coming. He wasn't looking forward to it. We have a story in the gospel that the night before this all began, he wept so intensely. He prayed so intensely that he literally burst capillaries in his skin and sweat blood, which is an actual attested to medical condition that does happen under times of extreme duress. He very much so knew what was coming and willingly entered into it. And we have to understand this, he died brutally. This is not just some nice little picture of somebody sacrificing something offhandedly for the other. We talk about this so often, that I'll sacrifice for others. When we say that so often, we mean, oh yeah, I've got some extra I can slide your way. Jesus didn't slide some extra to the way of humanity. Jesus gave every bit, every ounce of everything he had when he died on that cross, and he did so in the most brutal way that was humanly possible. But now here's the last piece. This is what I want to kind of leave you with. You'll understand it more after next week. But what happened when Jesus died? He loved us all. That can be hard for us to understand, and I can understand how that can trip us up. Well, how can willingly letting yourself be brutally murdered equal love? Well, again, next week, you will see those pieces fit together. But here's what Jesus also said in John 15, 5 chapters after what we just looked at, where he said he was going to lay his life down. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. Greater love is no one than this, than that he lay down his life for his friends. To sacrifice what you have for the good of someone else. Not to give just a little bit of that extra, but to go all in and say, I will give you every last bit. That is the truest, purest, most powerful love. That is what was on Jesus' mind. He hung on that cross out of obedience to the Father, knowing what it took to pay a debt. But he did it internally motivated because he is love and he does love. That is what this picture is, as brutal and repulsive and repugnant as it humanly can be. It is still a picture of the deepest, most expansive love that you can imagine. So why would Jesus die like this? That's what we just said. Because he loves. Ephesians 5:2. It tells us this. Walk in love. Walk in love. Why? We'll do it as Jesus loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Jesus was willing to die, brutally, murdered. Why? Because he loves. So I want to ask you this question. In light of that, in light of Jesus dying because of this love, what will you do with the problem of Jesus? Because Jesus creates a problem. If he was who he said he was, if he did what he said he did, then he's either the Lord of creation, that crazy lunatic, or an outright liar. How you answer that question changes the course of your eternity. I invite you to wrestle with that. I invite you, if you don't really know how to answer that question, I want to talk to you. You can reach out to us online. I'd be happy to connect with you that way. Today, again, we have one of our discovery tracks where if you're maybe new to the church, we're going to answer some of those questions, but you can come there and I'd be happy to sit down and chat with you more about this man, Jesus. But if you've already come to the point of saying, yeah, I think Jesus is who he said he is. I think he did what he said he did. And I think that means he's Lord. Are you going to live like that? Because it's not just, well, yes, I intellectually acknowledge it, but are you willing to love as he loved, like Ephesians 5 tells us? Are you willing to sacrifice? Because if so, there's an incredible world that God has created that unfortunately now is steeped in brokenness, but that you can bring wholeness and repair into, you can bring redemption into. And I want to challenge you to do that. We're going to sing a song called Jesus Paid It All. Beautiful song. It cries out that truth, but it begs that question. If Jesus paid it all, what am I going to do with what he paid for?